right, it is my pleasure to welcome Carey Harrison. Carey, is your title actually Professor of Humor, or is that just something you tell as a joke?
I think it's one of those titles like President of the United States that you can't discard, and that hangs around your shoulders for the remainder of your career. So I think once Professor of Humor, always Professor of Humor, and it's a real post endowed by some kindly CUNY graduate, which I wound up with. And then you're only allowed to keep it actively for 2 years, which is as long as your sense of humor is likely to last if you're the Professor of Humor. But I think you go on being Professor of Humor into all eternity.
Well, I have to say, knowing quite a number of your books, you've earned the title. Carey Harrison is the author of, I think it's 16 novels. I have not read all of them, but the ones that I have read have an extraordinary blend of humor and poignancy, something that's very hard to put together. Often in a single book, and certainly in different books. For those of you who haven't read Carey's work, let me recommend his extraordinary quartet, The Heart Beneath. Just an incredible blend of those two, of history, of imagination. There's also, in a completely different key, and shorter if you want to begin, his novel Justice, although it is short and I found it wonderful. But if you think that's all there is to Carey Harrison's writing, then you really should turn to the quartet. Okay, he is Professor of Humor. We've established at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. He's also a playwright, and he's also often worked as an actor. And Carey, I've sometimes asked Carey, since he joined the board, to be the closer, be the last speaker at a conference. And this time I asked him to start us off. And he said, well, he was happy to be either the opener or the closer. This is not I don't want to suggest a touch of vanity or something. I'm sure you'd be happy if I put you elsewhere, but please introduce us to the Eumenides.
Oh, Lord. Yes, the Humanities, that I teach Athenian tragedy from time to time, but I'm not a scholar, and what I'm going to give you now briefly is 15 minutes worth of positioning of the Humanities for its audience, as I understood Aeschylus to be intending it for the enormous number of the community of Athens that he was able to speak to. So I've tried to set the scene, essentially, for our further discussions. I'll start in, shall I? The question raised by Aeschylus in the Eumenides is whether to legitimize vengeance, taking the law, as we say, into our own hands. We say this now, but in the Eumenides, we're in a world of custom rather than law. Or to punish the avenger by handing him over to the dark gods whose role it is in our play to hound a matricide to his death. I shall contend that the author has more in mind than the attempted resolution of an exemplary knot, the toils of the house of Atreus, and more in mind than the offer of a conclusion to a notorious vendetta. The Eumenides serves, in fact, to establish a beginning, not an end. It is a foundational right justifying and enshrining the site of its storytelling, the Theater of Dionysus in the city of Athens. The play enacts the very meaning of Athens as the moment of civilization that makes theater possible. Theater as a place where all but the entire community gathers to be a part of the rite. Presenting this requires of the author that the festival of Dionysus be recruited. Once the effigy of Dionysus the dreamer literally takes its seat in the auditorium and the festival may begin, to an expression of something new, symbolically speaking, the city, a thing whose meaning is remade by theater itself and by the court of law instituted by Athena. 500 years earlier, in fact, slightly more than 500 years, the court was prefigured at the hands of Hephaestus, armorer to the gods, on Homer's imaginary shield of Achilles. The shield's portrayal of a gigantic panorama is clearly supernatural. Some shield. Homer's catalogue of its sculpted riches make it seem the size of a football field. And that's the point. It's not a real shield. It's a vision made metal. And in it, or on it, is a supernatural animal, a place where grievances are heard by representatives of the community, a court of law. Aeschylus takes this baton and runs with it. As the audience in their thousands watch a drama unfold, they are redefining, audience and performers together, the very essence of a city. Not trade, not consumption or comfort, not readiness for war or magnificent displays, but communication. Vengeance is the very thing of which communication and the transparency of the city itself must make a prime example. Vengeance, precisely what not only the court, but the city must render atavistic and unwanted. In fact, anachronistic. Of course, the joke's on us. It's anything but gone even today. Abandoning for a moment the position of the audience for whom Aeschylus was writing, we might consider how our contemporary myth-making responds to the question as posed: what price vengeance? Except when wartime morality is invoked, few plays or movies condone murder, regardless of the circumstances. Even when rough justice is fittingly meted out, so-called poetic justice, with the audience understood to empathize with the person who seeks to settle the score, the story will almost invariably punish a figure who repays murder with murder. This is the matrix we derive from the first wave of modern revenge tragedies in the 17th century. The hero in these plays, and Prince Hamlet is their avatar, has good cause, as Orestes does in the tragedy named for him, to repay murder with murder. The god Apollo, son of Zeus, told me to do it, is Orestes' plea. But today we have no Apollo, no god with a small g to provide an excuse, although the voices made me do it remains a not uncommon defense, and we pride ourselves on permitting a verdict of not guilty by virtue of insanity. In our society, this leads not to freedom, as achieved by Orestes, but to incarceration, which some might consider little better than the company of the ancient avenging Furies. Where vengeance is the issue, modern tales share a morality with ancient ones in the 17th century as today. The thrust of the tradition is one we share with the Athenians. This must cease. And modern storytellers usually work to manufacture a believable truce, interrupt the vendetta, and draw a line under the latest iteration of an eye for an eye. First, though, the author of this latest iteration, be he or she as pure of heart as Hamlet, shall suffer. And whoever carries out the sentence must do it swiftly in the case of the Oresteia, before Orestes has heirs who might inherit the curse, one older than the house of Atreus into which Orestes was born. King Tantalus, the originator, sought to test the gods by feeding them his son to see if they'd notice, and is currently imprisoned in the underworld, forever reaching up famished to the fruit-laden branch that lifts out of reach before his clutching hands. How bring all this, the many horrific crimes of succeeding generations, to a just end? The court of the Areopagus, which Athena declares to be a wholly new kind of council, aims to establish something as hard to achieve as justice. It aims for finality. The justice it metes out may be far from satisfactory to our eyes, but for Aeschylus and his audience, the chief ambition of this foundational lawsuit, the chorus of Furies versus Arrestees, was less to justify a verdict than to establish Athens as the city where the losers, the dark gods, are granted a house, a home. In effect, they're offered a toga as a reward for their new forbearance. They will be revered by their fellow citizens. They will still be gods, but no other gods have their kind of cozy city domicile. They will be turned by their consent from the ungracious ones into the gracious or kindly ones, who will bless marriages and births and relinquish their awful, savage, drooling aspect, which you would hardly want at your child's christening bending over the cradle. They will be all-important guests, witnesses, not avengers. Not only does this transformation give the play its bizarrely upbeat title, the very title bestowed on the new Furies by Athena, but as I believe Rainey will be reminding us, it formally unites the old gods, represented in the courtroom by the Furies, to the new gods represented by Apollo. This compact is the hard political reality underlying the sensational headline fodder of the verdict. As regards justice, there is nothing remotely fair about the trial and its outcome. Athena, who votes for acquittal, is half-sister to the defense attorney. Apollo, a situation no modern court would accept. And she too is one of the new gods. As she even admits, not only is she on her father Zeus's side, and not only have I lost my place on my laptop, but I don't know how to continue from here. Forgive me, my dears. Here we are. There's nothing remotely fair about the trial and its outcome. Athena, who votes for acquittal, is half-sister to the defense attorney, Apollo, a situation no modern court would accept. And she too is one of the new gods. As she even admits, not only is she on her father Zeus's side, and therefore on Apollo's and Arrestees' side, she herself never had a mother, having been born directly from Zeus's head. She is patriarch and matriarch at once, a warrior and a sage, which makes her hard to argue with. She arrives at the trial, fresh from Trojan combat, slipping on her judge's robes over her armor. All this is pretty tough on the Furies, who are already battling Zeus's son in the form of Apollo, and tough on Clytemnestra's ghost, which flies in, a little like Hamlet's wandering conscience, from the underworld to stir the Furies to action. And the fact is that any true accounting of Orestes' guilt would have to take up his mother's reasoned argument for her own vengeful act, and go back at least as far as his father Agamemnon's sacrifice of Orestes' sister, Iphigenia, in order to get a wind to convey his ships to war. If called as a witness, Agamemnon would say, Calchas the seer told me to do it. In the event, the only mention of Agamemnon's guilt is an all too brief reference to family issues by Clytemnestra's ghost. So the trial, as I anticipate that Stephen and Glenn will lay bare, is an imperfect investigation of the case at hand, and the verdict is arguably rigged by Athena's participation as a voter. But Aeschylus' audience haven't come to see justice celebrated. What they've come for, and what Aeschylus supplies, is an affirmation of their city's claims to be the home of law itself. Their city has incorporated, rather than eliminated, the forces of the night. They are the city-state supreme. This makes it hard for us to take up the play, indeed the entire trilogy, and interrogate its validity as legal process. It fails the test, but it never aspired to the test. Its purpose was to make the Theater of Dionysus the house of Athenian primacy, to establish the theater as a form of speaking temple, celebrating the stories that ally the new gods to the old, by dramatizing the challenges that beset the human race in its weakness, its venality, its hubris, its inescapable lusts. Now, to put these in perspective and punish where punishment is due, this is why we need the gods. They too are venal, so they understand us, but they are gods, which is to say that their powers, unlike ours, are eternal and their help is supernatural. Some crimes are beyond mortal wit to encompass, and their punishment beyond mortal authority to administer with confidence. We might say the same things today. The Areopagus court makes a few thoroughly modest inroads. It installs the concept of 12 jurors. We also inherit the concept of a hung jury as acquittal, convenient for Athena, about which subsequent legal systems have mixed feelings, but the convention is a merciful one. We might even say a kindly one. The play and its outcome warn us that without law and structures to sustain it, chaos is come again, as Othello says. But above all, it bequeaths us a sense that the dark forces are still always with us and need to be honored in order to be tamed. For 5th century Athenians, Homeric Greece was much closer than the 6 or 7 centuries that separated them. All the stories that gave Athens and its surrounding city-states their legitimacy were stories Homer sang. Yesterday's news, yet still current today. What the Eumenides chronicles is something remarkable under the Homeric sun. Progress, a new development. In a universe of seemingly fixed stars, the cosmos judders forwards and gives birth to an idea, a conception of lasting peace and the opportunity to enact it, a court of justice to which, if all subscribe and all respect the old gods, we may look in hope. What wouldn't we give for such a court to adjudicate, say, the troubles of the Middle East with the prior consent of all parties? But who could we trust to be our parthenogenetic Athena, our final dispositor of mercy? A play or film in praise of the court of The Hague would have a hard time measuring up. To return in closing to the stories we tell now. Arguably, the modern era begins as Hamlet is being written, and as the revenge drama tradition is less being born than reborn, heirs to Athenian tragedy. Modern dramatists may sweat to provide closure, but in whose name shall they provide finality in a secular world? Only in the name of convenience, of closing the door to keep the future out. Because what, for instance, happened to Orestes after he was set free to be King Arrestees of Argos? I doubt if many in Aeschylus's audience in the Theater of Dionysus could have told you. As with so many Greek myths, the trail goes cold after the action reaches its zenith. The meat is surrendered to the jackals of history, releasing numerous versions, including the best known one in which Orestes marries Hermione, daughter of Helen of Troy, and they have a son. I picture him as a beautiful boy. And Orestes goes on to rule the entire Eastern Mediterranean before dying of snakebite. Interesting. But first, how this version of Orestes post-trial comes about. Menelaus and Helen, despairing of that outcast renegade and matricide Orestes as a suitor, had married Hermione off to a cove called Neoptolemus. So Orestes simply kills Neoptolemus and makes off with his wife. Do Neoptolemus's family come after Orestes? History, or rather mythology, does not relate. But what our wise and multifoliate Greek mythology makes clear is, Areopagus caught or not, there is no happily ever after. Not for everyone. Having been scared out of their wits by the appearance of the Furies, Aeschylus's audience emerged for a toilet break before the fourth play, a lost satyr play called Proaches. Some of them carrying their newborn infants, if we believe the old tale the pregnant women gave birth at the beginning of the Eumenides, so terrifying and unexpected were the incarnation of the Furies. Certainly they emerged feeling ennobled, I fancy, by Aeschylus's supple and majestic language. Only Shakespeare can hold a candle to the Agamemnon. They emerged proud to be Athenians. And this, I would argue, was the author's overriding purpose, admirably carried out.
Thank you very much, Carey. I have a question. I'm not sure whether you're the right person to answer it. Glenn might want to chime in here. One of the questions I kept asking myself, and your talk reminded me of this in rereading this, why do they keep coming back to the curse on the house of Atreus? You know, or why it seems to be something like the founding myth and not playing an unsimilar function to original sin in Christian culture. And I wonder if you have thoughts about why do they keep writing different versions of exactly this story? What?
Well, it's an exemplary Vendetta story, and it winds up in the lap of Athena to resolve by creating modernity within the world of classical Greece by her solution. I mean, there are so many unresolved vendettas in the whole cartography of Greek myth. And this one has a special quadruple whammy with generation after generation feeding children to other people to eat. It's a horrible recurrent horror in the story that comes down to become the story of the House of Atreus. But by that time, the gods have been asked to eat a child. Brothers have given each other their children to eat. It's probably the most gruesome of all the vendettas, if you were to try and choose one, and the longest running, and the one that allows you to look forwards in hope, unlike almost all the others.
Because of the solution, we can hope because of Athena at the
yes,
end.
we can hope because of Athena, and to my mind, because of the city, because I think the whole idea really is that the city is itself the great innovation, greater than the court of law, although they're inextricable and one permits the other. And obviously this is not the first city on the face of the earth. Nonetheless, symbolically, I think it is in the Greek understanding of it, of the city-state and of what the city permitted, the fact that their city had theater, and theater was this extraordinary way of the society telling itself the stories that justified, that enshrined their existence and justified it. All of that was what the city was. It was so short-lived, and yet it was a city in which civilization blossomed in the most remarkable way, as we still, as our own society bears witness to it. So storytelling itself, on the scale in which the Festival of Dionysus offered, was just a truly extraordinary thing.
So the idea is, if you take the very worst origin story that you could possibly take,
yes.
because it's way worse than, the sin in the Garden of Eden. I mean, it's just,
yes.
is horrifying, and it goes on and on. If you take the very, very worst we can imagine and you give it a resolution in the end,
Yes.
then you have a kind of founding of civilization out of barbarism, and that's why they repeat it, because it seems to me, of course, they don't always have a happy end. I mean, as you pointed out, the story doesn't always have a happy ending.
And that's the resolution comes on a human level in terms of the human characters. But as I know that Rainey could elaborate this much better than I can, but the fact is that beneath or above or within all this is also a huge battle between the old gods and the new gods, which has to be resolved in some form so that the Greek world doesn't tear itself apart. And that's where the Furies being given a place, a seat, a role, a costume, a house in Athens is such a remarkable gesture that brings about a reconciliation between the old gods and the new, an inclusion of the old gods, of the old barbaric id is accommodated into the ego of the city and its superego. And so it's possible to imagine a redemption for the Greek gods and their incorporation in a new future. I mean, it's so extraordinarily hopeful. It's hard to remember how short-lived it was before the Peloponnesian Wars tore it all apart again.
Of course, as I'm going to talk about a bit tomorrow in my talk, yes, they're given a home, but it's underground. And I think that's turns out to be significant. Let me just notice, I'm really sorry, I overlooked a number of remarks and questions to Daniel's reading in the Q&A function, or F&A. I will read them in a moment, but let me just invite anybody who would like to make a comment or ask a question about Carey's talk to add them if you're in the audience to the Q&A function, or if you'd like to make a remark to the people who are panelists, please do. Any comments? I'm also curious about the old and new gods and what, oh, Rainey, please.
Yeah, Carey, thank you. That was really stimulating. I'm not going to talk about the old and new gods, and besides, Glenn is far more qualified, as is Wendy, indeed, to talk about them than I. I want to ask about Hamlet.
Yes.
Because it seems to me this is such a striking parallel. Surely this is what Shakespeare had in mind.
Yes.
We have the old Hamlet's ghost as Clytemnestra's ghost.
Yes.
We have Claudius as Aegisthus.
Yes, yes.
The big change is, of course,
yes.
that Hamlet doesn't kill Gertrude, although he comes awfully close.
He does come close, it's true.
He does come really close to doing it. And moreover, instead of, to return to Susan's really interesting question about the curse. So as far as we know, this house, the Danish royal house, has had a rough time in the recent past, but its crimes do not stretch back generations. And moreover, instead of Orestes and Electra, as far as we know, Electra also goes off scot-free, although she's an accomplice. The house of Hamlet, both old and new, is wiped out at the end of the play. Fortinbras to take over. And I'm really curious about what you think, why Shakespeare must have made every single one of those changes with malice aforethought. He must have really thought about why he was not going to tell this tale as it had been told. I'm really interested in what you think about that.
Well, that's right. But I think what makes the crucial difference is the presence of the gods. Orestes is not a man alone facing up to the responsibility of killing his mother and what that will involve. Unlike Hamlet, who is facing, unsupported by anything except the possibly demonic ghost of his father, and the support of his friend Horatio, who seems to be saying, go on, you're all right. But he is facing alone the potential danger, the dangers to his soul of killing his uncle and avenging his father, whereas Orestes is caught up in a web of supernatural danger in the form of the Furies, who will chase him round the back of the north wind forever. But also he has a supernatural ally in Apollo, who does actually advise him to do the deed. So you have these, in a way, little human figures dwarfed by the larger contest between the old and the new gods, who are duking it out in terms of their own possession of the human world as their playground. Whereas when we come to Shakespeare and we come away from really any religious perspective at all, and the great thing about, the fascinating thing about Hamlet is that it is virtually impossible to figure out what the religion of the court of Denmark is. It's a religion never seen before. It's a cosmos never seen before. The description by Hamlet Senior, by old King Hamlet, of the circumstances of his release from his purgatorial prison bear no relationship to Christianity in any form that anyone has ever known. And it's this is where Shakespeare is so intriguing, because he's not really a Christian at all. He's a pagan, and this is his salvation. That his version of Christianity is never very believable, and he tries not to articulate it. Angels and ministers of grace defend us, cries Hamlet, and it's almost as near as Shakespeare ever gets to declaring partisanship on behalf of Christianity. Otherwise, God and Christ never appear, and they won't, because Shakespeare's heart has been with pagan Warwickshire, which he finds echoed in pagan Rome, where he's very, very happy and he loves the Roman pantheon, because he wants nothing to do, very rightly, with Christianity, which is the most incredibly slippery tightrope at the time of his life. You can fall off on the Catholic side and be burned, or on the Protestant side and be burned. And it's said that his father was a secret Catholic, although I think there's very little proof of it. But he saw nowhere to rest his head in religion. So in Hamlet, you have a bizarre, invented, concocted religion which underwrites the ghost, and leaves Hamlet really in perplexity. Did he see a demon, or did he see his father? And why doesn't he get on with this murder? It is very like the thing that most reminds me of Hamlet's self-admonishments are Clytemnestra's admonishments to the Furies, like, come on, wake up, get on with it. You're supposed to be hounding this guy, much as Hamlet's conscience says to him, you're supposed to be killing your uncle. So it's that move from a classical Greek world to a Renaissance world, which gives us individuality in its modern form, and Hamlet is taking on himself the savagery of the deed that was committed on his father. His father's murder he will repeat by murdering his father's murderer, and that remains, I think, so interestingly, after all these centuries, that remains an act, a deed that we will expect to see punished. An avenging murder is criminalized by vengeance, just as it is in classical Greece. It hadn't moved on, and that's where Hamlet is still the avatar of modern revenge stories. So many of them movies in which somebody that we sympathize with, as we do with Hamlet, has to carry out vengeance on behalf of the wife who was killed, the parents who were killed, the friends who were killed. And yet in the end, if he commits mayhem, he must die. We haven't got beyond that. It's exactly the same story, which regardless of the religious framework, which is mesmerizing to me.
Carey, that fits very well. We have a question from the audience. Thank you, Gerd Brendel, who asks, why did the court not decide to punish Orestes by decreeing capital punishment, thus also ending revenge by a proper verdict?
Yes, yes, that would have been interesting. That would have ended it. Would have said, all right, one more blow of the axe, and that's it. But Greek tragedy was not obliged to be tragic in any sense that we use the word. And there is such an enormous resolution by both foiling, defeating the Furies and gifting them a role at the heart of the city, underground, as you say. But that's where they're used to being. They wouldn't, if you put them in a penthouse, you'd find them in the basement the following day. But giving them a role of significance in the society, that's a wonderful opportunity that Aeschylus takes. And I think it's that opportunity, it's his taking of that opportunity that enables us to understand the play properly. That is really what the play makes available, is incorporating the savage old gods. Now, in doing so, that leaves on the other side of the balance, you've given such an enormous thing to the Furies that you can give something no less enormous to Orestes as you create this everlasting peace, so called. Although, as I pointed out, Orestes goes off and kills Hermione's husband in order to marry her, with nary a backward look to see whether there are Furies on his trail as he kills Neoptolemus. So there's actually nothing has been instituted about crime and justice at all. Hence my argument that the real issue here is the old gods and the new gods, and allowing the old gods in and creating a new world of Athens which will accommodate both.
Anybody else like to ask or comment? Because if not, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to read the comments for Daniel that I forgot to,
I'd like to hear those too.
Read. Old and new gods. Besides just being old and new, is there something that they represent? I'm thinking of, I guess one shouldn't say this, although there are plenty of left-wing magazines that are, running headlines like war criminal found dead as a Donald Rumsfeld.
That's right.
But I do remember Rumsfeld's discussion very well, as a matter of fact, of old and new Europe, which, strangely enough, at least in Germany, many commentators took seriously to see if there was a philosophy of history behind it. And of course, there was nothing behind it except saying, you old guys, we don't need you anymore.
No, that's right.
But I'm wondering if there's something to the old and new gods here.
Well, you have to remember that Olympus, where the new gods live and is connected to the old gods by Zeus as the master of Olympus. Olympus is a kind of playground of, it's really a human playground glorified by the immortality of the participants. But it's taking the world of the city-state and carrying it up. I mean, Troy in Homer's, in the Troy that Homer offers us, is a magnificent city. And Olympus is just a step up, because they're burning flesh on the sands outside Troy, the Greeks are, so that the smell, the inhalation of the meat on Olympus will be pleasing to the gods. And that's the relationship between the two worlds. It's just a glorified human world. The world of the old gods was a barbaric place of people tearing each other apart, and it had no domicile. It had no lovely world of couches and marble that Olympus, in everybody's imagination, including at the time, was composed of. And the old gods are left prowling the night, are prowling around the human events, whereas the new gods have adopted humanity as their pets. And it's a whole new start for gods, forgetting the horrors of the battles between the old gods, and yet they're still there. And many Greeks remember Kronos, remember what Zeus did, remember what the birth of the younger gods was, a horrific and barbaric thing. So I think that the Furies allow Aeschylus to at least say to the Athenians, however much justified or not, okay, here's a new start. We can recuperate these savage old beings and give them a place, and no longer be divided at the theological level, at the level of the divine.
Thank you. That's actually quite helpful. I want to read a couple of comments from our current fellow, Sham Wupaluri, who is unfortunately, because of the pandemic, still stuck in Mumbai, but we're hoping he will join us soon. Sham, I do hope you're still listening, and I'm sorry that I didn't read these before. Sham says, thank you very much, Daniel, for this amazing reading. One of the unpublished writings from Gödel's Nachlass reads, what we commonly regard as objects have concrete boundaries and hence do not have the highest abstraction. Sets have boundaries in how they're defined, and this explains the failure shown by Russell in trying to regard the set of all sets as both an object and the highest abstraction. This also supports my belief that there is no shoreline for mind in mathematics, and that the human mind suffices to partake of this unboundedness, whereas if it is captured by a bodily organ, then it is bounded. It's rather the possibility to make the all into an object that drives our expandability, much as the ordinals and set theory transcend all boundaries. While we can read off many such analytic notions off our mind, can we truly reconcile the two worlds we live in? World of logico-scientific abstraction and real world, which is murky, chaotic, and inconsistent. In other words, do you think our endless efforts to achieve logico-scientific consistency reshape and enable us to tend to the real world challenges and alleviate suffering? Long, big question. Sham, I hope you're here.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can say something really valid to answer this very complex question, but I would say that Gödel would not, I think, and the quote the note you're quoting points into that direction. Gödel would not agree that there is a world of logic and the world, a messy world of human suffering. He was, like many eminent mathematics, he was a real Neoplatonist. I mean, using that term not in a very strict sense, but for him, only logical objects were real and mathematical objects. And so for example, also that thing he says in my little scene, that you couldn't kill, that he refutes that idea that you could travel back in time, kill your own father or mother, and thus create some kind of paradox. He was actually asked that question, and he said you couldn't do it. It wouldn't work because it's not logical, because it would create a paradox. So for him, there are only mathematical objects. And the messy world is really an annoying illusion. So, and you could, of course, say, looking at the world like that seriously is a path to madness. I don't know about that, probably. But yeah, I think that that was his position on that.
Thank you. And I have a question from our staff member, Franziska Bomsky. Thank you so much for the delightful reading. As a literary scholar, I would be interested. There's some, not many, other contemporary authors referring to mathematics in their work, for example, Dart or Kohlmeier. Is there anyone who was or is of interest to you in this regard?
Well, I would say Stoppard is a big model for me on how to do this in a way that's really kind of perfect. It's not he often refers to mathematics, also to philosophy, to broader subjects of philosophy, but I think no one has done it in such a playful and at the same time profound way. And so that play, for example, that is really heavily in debt to Tom Stoppard.
Do you have any other remarks, questions, anything to add to this really quite delightful opening? And if not, I want to thank Daniel and Carey for starting us off in two quite different keys, both of which, it's funny, yes, I hope we're not, well, we will spend our time talking about killing parents and children, whether paradoxically or not, but thank you for starting us off in such a lovely way. And I hope to see most of you tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central European Time. Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.